talk about holy, healthy marriages, which is as the foundation for a holy family. So I like to introduce myself a little bit so you know who I am. I grew up in eastern Colorado. I grew up on a farm out near the Kansas border, town of Stratton. I went to college in Greeley and then finished my undergrad. I was going to be a teacher in history at Metro here in Denver. After college, I went right to Net Ministries, which is an organization that does retreats for junior high and high school students across the country. And I worked for Net for 3 years. Decided I didn't want to be a teacher. I went back to grad school in Minnesota for marriage and family therapy. And then, as a marriage and family therapist, I worked in lots of different settings. I did in-home family therapy, primarily for the Medicaid population in Minneapolis. I worked out in Burlington, and when you work in the small rural areas, you really become a generalist therapy, right? So some of my youngest clients were 4 or 5 years old. My oldest were 80 or 90 in a nursing home who apparently was friends with my grandmother, but I was the only therapist in the county, so your boundaries are a little bit different, so we still work with them. I worked for a couple years out in the Thornton area doing just intakes for community mental health center. And I've been at St. Raphael's for 4 years, where I see a lot of couples, a lot of families. I'm also the operations director, so I do a lot of some of the business end of stuff. Let's see, I'm married, my wife Megan. We've been married for 4.5 years. We have a 3-year-old daughter, Agnes, almost 2-year-old son, William, and then we'll have Augustine, should be born sometime in December. Let's see. So that's a little bit about who I am. So we're talking about the structure of family and how the structure is important today. So there's a lot of different modalities in which you can do therapy. This comes from one of those modalities called structural family therapy. Salvador Minuchin is the theorist who kind of came up with some of these ideas. And the idea is if we have the right hierarchy of the family, if we have a good structure to the family, everything else tends to go pretty well. It's when the boundaries and the structure gets messed up, or we bring something else into the structure of the family, then things don't go so well and we have to kind of restructure the family. So a well-functioning family has a well-established hierarchy, and it is not defined by the absence of stress or conflict, but how effectively it handles them as it responds to the developing needs of its members and the changing conditions in its environment. So having a good structure and really healthy boundaries actually allows flexibility. So if we really need to have some of that flexibility, and we can't trick ourselves into believing that if we have stress, if we have problems, that means we're unhealthy. That means we're normal. It's just how we handle the stress and the problems determines whether we're healthy or not, and how healthy we are. So the hierarchy of family, the hierarchy that we want is this. We want God up top. We want husband and wife down below. Oops. Husband and wife, and then we want the children below that. If we have that right hierarchy, now Salvador Minuchin doesn't put God in the hierarchy of the family, but I think it's really important that we do. So if we can put God first, and then husband and wife are on the same page, and then the children. So the marital relationship is more important, has a higher priority than the relationship with the children. I often say in therapy or whenever I'm speaking that the best thing that we can give our children is a holy, healthy marriage. That's the best thing. That's better than taking them to 55 softball tournaments so that they might get a scholarship. It's better than giving them the opportunities or pushing them in academia so they can go to college. What this relationship, right, was we can model them, and we know this from our own family. Like if we think about it, our normal is set by our parents in their relationship. And that's what we expect. And so if we can model and give them that normal of a really healthy relationship and marriage, things, they're going to be set up for success. And so that's something we tend to remember, tend to kind of struggle with in our society, I think. Just need a couple slides. So sometimes things like, well, I think the most common thing in our society where the hierarchy gets messed up is we put children too high, right? So the parents focus up on the children, and we focus too much on their needs, and we neglect this marriage. There's lots of reasons for that. One is we want to give our kids the best opportunity that they can have. Two, I think sometimes the first few years of marriage, and then we implement an infant into it, and I know this from very personal recent experience, right? It's very stressful. And so it becomes necessary for a short time, right? An infant child, you have to put them higher in the hierarchy because they need so much care. But we have a hard time readjusting those boundaries back. And then we just don't want to do the tough work of fixing the marriage or reintegrating the marriage and putting it back. We just tend to leave children at the top of the hierarchy because it's easier and it's more convenient. And that really causes big problems for the marriage and the family down the line. Okay, so the overarching concepts I think that we need to remember as we go through today is we have to be purposeful, right? We have to have a purpose, right? If we can see something today that says, okay, this is a change that we need to make in our life. So being here helps us to be purposeful because we can identify things that need to change. And we need to do that with our spouse on a regular basis. And we need to be purposeful. We need to be intentional. Okay? Things don't happen organically. We don't improve and we don't get the marriage and the family that we want organically. It has to be intentional. It has to be purposeful. We have to set a plan. I think this idea of a organically healthy marriage is a bigger struggle for women than it is for men. I'll pick on the men later, but for women, we just really want our husband to know us and to understand us and to anticipate our needs, which sounds great, right? I remember driving around with one of my friends when she was newly married. We were in Minnesota, and there's this restaurant, and it was kind of a bar, and then it turned into a restaurant Sunday. It's called W.A. Frost and Company, and she's like, oh, I really hope my husband takes me there for Sunday brunch because I heard it's really awesome. And I said, oh, does he know that you want to go to W.A. Frost? And she's like, no, I just want him to figure it out and take me there and so I can be surprised. And I said, that might be a little bit far-fetched. Right? So we have to be kind of let go of some of that organic nature and make this really purposeful and really choosing the best marriage that we can have. Okay, so how do we keep God at the top? So we're Catholic. We want to embrace the life of the church. There's lots of ways to be faithful Catholics. And what I mean by that is there's certain things that all of us have to do, right? We have to go to Mass, confession twice a year. Those are precepts of the Catholic Church. So we need to do those things, right? But our family, maybe praying a rosary every night doesn't work for our family. Maybe it's more spontaneous prayer. Maybe it's charismatic prayer. But there's lots of different spiritualities, so if it doesn't work, we need to find what does work. Maybe it's Ignatian and very structured. So there's different ways to have a holy, healthy marriage. I think this is some of what Jim was getting at when he was talking, is that sometimes we view families that seem really holy, and so we just try to do what they do, and that doesn't always work. Some of it we can take, and some of it doesn't work for us, but we need to create our own family culture. We need to have a mission. What's our family mission? Are we really into the pro-life movement? Are we really into evangelization? How do we do that? Are we really into serving the poor? But we need some sort of way, some sort of mission that our family is working towards helping the people of God. And so a mission is really important for a family. And I think that's important to remember. Prayer, you actually need 3 different prayer lives. I would say you even need 3 different spiritualities almost within a family, which is hard to think about, and it's kind of maybe, if we don't have a robust prayer life, it's maybe a little bit daunting. But we have to have an individual prayer life, because if we don't have an individual prayer life, we can't share what God gives us to our spouse, right? And we should be feeding our spouse, right? They should experience Christ through us. And we have to have an individual prayer life, an individual spirituality in order to be able to do that with our spouse. We need a family prayer life, and we need to pray with our children, and we should pray together, and again, we should have a mission as a family, and we should go to church together, and I think that's a little more common. I think what's most uncommon of these 3 prayer lives is a couple prayer life. Oftentimes I've found in Catholic couples, because that's where we're mostly, we don't pray together as spouses. We pray together as families, we have individual prayer lives, but it's really hard for us to develop that spiritual life with our spouse. And we need to pray for our marriage, not just for our children, and to develop that spirituality around what is it for us as a couple? How do we encounter God together? And that's part of developing that. I should say I'm moving pretty fast, so this is a pretty broad topic, and I want to give us some time for some discussion, because this is a small enough group that we can do that. So if you have questions, please write them down, and I can go into a little bit more detail. We need to celebrate the sacraments: baptism, first reconciliation, Eucharist, confirmation. I like to ask the question, how do we give them their due, right? Do we celebrate a birthday more than we do a baptism? Do we celebrate graduating 3rd grade more than we celebrate first reconciliation? And I think our society does in general, but that's disordered, I believe. We need to give the sacraments their due. And part of the way that we can do that is to celebrate and make it a big deal. And really embrace the sacraments of the church. Mass. So I recognize that if you're at this conference, you probably go to Mass every Sunday. But also, I think it's really important to emphasize that we need to go to Mass every Sunday. We need to get there maybe even more than that, as often as possible. I think it's really good to prepare for Mass, right? To know what the readings are going to be, to talk about Mass afterwards, to have a ritual around Mass. I think all of those things are really good. I think I mentioned I have really small children, so oftentimes the readings kind of at Mass kind of miss us, because my 2-year-old in particular likes to crawl and climb and dive off of whatever he can. So we try to not be as distracting, to be as least distracting as possible. So sometimes I miss the reading. So what we've started doing on the way to church is we read the readings so that we're in tune with what's going on with Mass. That's one small way to prepare for Mass. I think rituals around Mass and around confession are really important. My dad becomes a short order cook every Sunday after Mass. Every Sunday, because there was only one Mass. It was a small town, so it was an 8 a.m. Mass. You had to feed the cattle before you went to Mass, so there was no time to eat breakfast. And so we got home from church, and he cooked however many pancakes and eggs and bacon and however he wanted them. And that's what we do every Sunday after Mass. And I have 3 of my brothers still live out there. We're going out there tomorrow, and we'll probably experience this kind of ritual, which I think is really healthy to have those rituals and to tie them into our faith and our spirituality. And if you were to ever miss Mass, everyone would know, because they went to Mass and they came, and so there was a little bit of accountability in that as well. I think reconciliation, a lot of times we wait until we really need to go to reconciliation, but I think it's really good to build that into a routine, especially with your children, to say, okay, we go to reconciliation every month or 6 weeks, or this is the time that we do it. And that can be really helpful to set that as the normal and the priority for your children. I talked about this. I want to say a little more about a couple's prayer. It can be really small at first, but the important thing is that we do it. And I think once we start to pray as a couple, then we allow God to start to work in that relationship with Him, and He can kind of direct us and lead us. I also think that on the spirituality of a couple, it's really important to have some sort of formation that we do together. I mentioned I did NET, and I know a lot of couples who came out of NET, and they had this similar formation experience, right? They went through it together, they did it together, and that actually really helped them because they're looking through things from the same lens. Now, so I have this experience. My wife was really involved with Life Team, and she did a lot of different young adult things, but we didn't have a similar formation. And I think that can become an issue. And so even doing something that's more basic maybe than what we need, there's no really wrong way to hear the gospel again, right? So we can go back to the basics and be formed together as a couple. I think that's really important. That similar formation, so that we have that to lean on. And there's tons of good programs. Someone mentioned the Catechism and the Catholic Biblical School. My wife and I did a program called Christ Life. Do you have that here at St. Thomas more? No. Probably something similar. There's other ones. But it's a evangelization type of program. But there's things that you can get involved in and do as a couple that will help you develop that couple's spirituality. Family prayer, I think talked about it's important to pray daily, and that prayer should grow, right? I think at first we just sang Hail Marys with our children, but now Agnes is old enough and she can learn prayers and pray with us, and so those prayers can become a little bit more robust as a family. I think mealtime, we can expand the Bless Us, O Lord. That's a good prayer. We should say that prayer. But we can expand it and give opportunities throughout the day to encounter God in a little bit more personal way than just the structured prayer. And structured prayers are great. And we should always be asking ourselves, how is God speaking to us through this prayer? And that should help us direct kind of our family life and our spirituality, is being able to hear and understand God. Okay. We want to build intimacy. There's two parts to intimacy, or two parts that I like to talk about intimacy. There's physical and emotional intimacy. So for men generally, physical intimacy leads to the desire to have emotional intimacy. For women, emotional intimacy, feeling close to my spouse, makes me want to have physical intimacy, right? In some ways it sounds like a cruel trick that God is playing on us, but when it's working, it's beautiful, right? It works. One leads to the other, which leads to this one, which leads to the other. And then it stops working, and it's like gears clanging against each other, because I want to feel close to you, so let's have physical intimacy. Well, I don't want to have physical intimacy until I feel close to you, and it can be a really big stressor for couples. It needs to work and blend together, and sometimes we have to give in and focus on the intimacy. So let's talk about emotional intimacy. On the right side, yeah. Okay, there's lots of ways to improve emotional intimacy. Weekly dates, going on dates regularly with your spouse. We tend to think about dates as dinner and a movie or dinner and the opera or something. That a date doesn't need to be nearly that big or extravagant all the time. It can be simply going for a walk in the park. Maybe your only opportunity is during nap time. If for some reason your kids actually nap at the same time and you have a little bit of space, like you can use that as a date. You can capitalize on that time. But we need to go on dates and we need to check in and be emotionally available. Technology blackout times can be really helpful. I think we use technology to decompress. One of the more common complaints from women is women, they get home at night and their husband, right? So if they're a stay-at-home mom, then they cook dinner and they're ready and they're yearning to talk and connect with their husband. And their husband just wants to decompress. And so it's to the phone that they go. And I think the first 30 minutes when couples reintegrate their lives after work is extremely important. And we should be able to eliminate technology and phones, especially during that time, so that we can create a really healthy environment so that we can connect. Because women really want to share their story with their husband. They want to share their lives and who they are. And a lot of times I think men come home and they're just tired and they just want to decompress. And so we need to find that balance, right? Maybe there's a 15-minute note like, hello, and I get 15 minutes to just shut off and then I come, but I have to really engage after that. I think business meetings are really, really important. So what I would call as a business meeting is a once a week or every other week meeting where we talk about schedule, we talk about finances, we talk about problems with the children, we talk about all these businessy type things, and so we can get it out of the way. What happens if we don't do that, then any small interaction time that we have becomes business meeting time. And all we do is schedule, and then feels like we become CEOs of this family household, or CEOs of the household, and we don't, we lack that, we deny the opportunity to have emotional intimacy. So a business meeting can be really helpful for that. Communicate your love purposely. The 5 love languages. Know your spouse's love language. Know your children's love language. If you don't know what a love language is, there's a book by Gary Chapman. I highly encourage it. It's a really good book. It talks about we experience and we receive love. And we don't have a whole lot of time to get into that today. I would say a clue is to do the things that you did at the beginning of the relationship. Right? So she really liked it when I bought her flowers, but I haven't bought her flowers in 3 years because it's different. But buy flowers or write notes and do those things that really help to connect you at the beginning of your relationship. Don't take your spouse for granted. And I think it's really important to notice when your spouse is going out of the way for you. Right? Notice that they gave up the 6th football game that they could have watched that weekend to spend time with you. Or, notice that, my wife cooked that dinner that she doesn't really like, but she knows I really like. Notice those things and appreciate those things. Okay. So physical intimacy. We're not going to get too detailed into this area, but we do need to communicate around physical intimacy. We do need to have conversations, and we need to be able to express ourselves and be on the same page. What's going well? What needs to change? What's happening? Do we use natural family planning? Would that help us deepen our physical intimacy? And following the teachings of the church on that. I think that's really important, and that can help. I think that actually helps men be involved more in like the fertility cycle, and it can be really powerful to help draw men and women together in this area. Pornography, masturbation, affairs, those are all physical intimacy that should stop, and they shouldn't be a part of our marriage. There's healing from that, but we need to get help if that's what we're struggling generally, because those are our big areas of struggle. Okay. So I think in a similar way, like there's different spiritualities, right? There's different ways to be Catholic. I could be charismatic, I could be Ignatian. But there's also a lot of different ways to parent. And I think there's really strict parents, there's really lenient parents that want the children to experience things and express themselves. And it's like a spectrum, right? There's being strict and being disciplined, like that's healthy up until a point, right? And letting your children have more kind of free expression and trying to step back, that's healthy up until a point. And we have to find, like, make sure that we're within that spectrum of finding that. And we have to find a way that works for both the husband and wife, and we need to have plans. So you got to be on the same page. I'm sure you've probably noticed several typos by now in my, that's not my strong suit, so there's a typo there. But we want to be on the same page. We need to communicate about how we're going to parent. We need to parent together, okay? We can't be good cop, right? We can't be dad gives in to everything, and then when something needs to be handled, mom steps in and she's the disciplinarian, or vice versa. We need to discipline together whenever we can. If we have a plan for discipline, and this is a great thing about having a business meeting, because we can say, hey, Agnes is getting out of bed 43 times every night. Right? We put her in bed and she comes out, she's like, Daddy, I just want to say I love you. And it's kind of hard to be mad at that first time, but 42nd time, it's like we have to deal with that, and we need to have a plan. And if I have one plan and Megan has another plan, it doesn't work so well. But if we're on the same page and we can implement the plan, we can break that down to 7 or 8 times, which is much more manageable. Benadryl, well. Okay, and we need to, I encourage you to work on the attachment with your children. I know that we've all heard of attachment theory, but it's important to establish and maintain a bond with your children. The hardest time to be attached to your children is during transition stages, right? And your children are always going to be more willing to transition to the next stage, right? If we think about teenagers, they're ready to have more freedom, and we as parents generally aren't ready to give that freedom up. And so we have to be aware, okay, this is really challenging. What kind of transition are we going through, and how can we maintain the bond through that transition? So sometimes with an unruly teenager, it's just as important to take them out to breakfast and do something special with them as it is to discipline them. Now they're both important, but sometimes it's easy for us to forget, and sometimes it feels like we're encouraging the negative behavior if we make some sort of special time. But I think if we're really struggling with a child, sometimes it's good just to give them some time where they can't be in trouble and you just really enter into their world. Because if we have an underlying attachment, discipline works better. If we have a strong attachment, then when I'm disciplined and I understand that I did something that was hurtful to my parents, it's going to affect me more, right? It's when we don't have that underlying attachment that kind of gets out of whack and it's not as effective. Discipline. Again, there's these different ways. I think I mentioned some love and limits, 1, 2, 3 magic, attachment parenting. There's all sorts of different strategies around discipline. Love and logic is natural consequences. So what would the natural consequence be? 1, 2, 3 magic. I like it because it's super simple. And it's basically, right, if I get to 3, this is going to happen. It's clear communication. It's helping them understand. It's giving them fair warnings. But with all of them, again, we need to build in some of that attachment and connecting with your children. And I think I'll say one other thing about parenting that I often comes up with in therapy with couples is this transition with older children, right? And the role that I have once my children have children. That's really hard sometimes. And there needs to be a lot of communication about what is okay for me to do, like what are you okay with? And because it can be a really sticking point and be really frustrating. Now, it's at the same time, it's really important for parents to have supports. And if we have what we call natural supports, we have grandparents and we have parents in the area that can come and give us a break, then that's really great. That's really helpful. But we also have to set up boundaries, and we have to kind of be on the same plan with our kids with that. Okay, so I know I went through a lot of information pretty quickly, purposely, because this is a big topic, but I wanted to give us some time for some questions and some discussion around any of these areas. So, any questions?
Can you talk about the difference between, I think the handout you gave is hierarchy of your family and structure. So I saw a lot of slides about structure, kind of logistics of how things work structurally within the family, but then the concept of hierarchy and how that might relate to spiritual authority for spiritual warfare. So I don't know if you're familiar. There's been a lot of talk about that lately, at least that I've seen with Father Chad Rippinger. I think it's Aquinas, and talking about the actual authority that one might have. I know it's debatable, but does that relate to the structure? I just help unpack that a little bit.
Okay. I am by no means an expert in spiritual warfare. I mean, I wouldn't deny that it exists. The hierarchy of the family, I mean, so, maybe when we're putting things higher up in the hierarchy, or we're implementing, maybe it's music or our place for sports, kind of opens us up for fracture and opens us up for some spiritual warfare. If we have good boundaries and we're really all pointed up towards God, and that's the hierarchy, right, is God, husband, wife, children. We have that, that's the hierarchy, and so the structure, how do we hold that structure? So that's how they work together. The hierarchy is what we want it to be, and then the structure and the boundaries is how we create and hold that structure. So how do we have a boundary that's strong enough, right, that something happens when we cross the boundary so that we know that there's a boundary, but yet isn't an 8-foot cement wall that you can't see over, right? Neither one of those are healthy, or no boundary, right? Just fence posts where the boundary should be isn't healthy, and neither is this like cement structure that is completely inflexible. I probably didn't do too well at answering your question.
No, you did. That's good. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay.
If the hierarchy is out of order, what's the best way to go about trying to get it back into proper order?
Yeah, I mean, it depends kind of what the hierarchy is. So, but it's a boundary issue, I think, a lot of times. So that to me, like, okay, where are we as husband and wife? That's a good thing to check. Like, are we on the same page? Are we connected? Are we both really integrated into the family? And if that's out of whack, then we can use these things like dates and business meetings, maybe a retreat, couples therapy, to kind of get that back in order. And then if we're putting children above the parent, like, again, that's we need a healthier boundary with parents, and to be able to work the children back into the natural, more healthy spot. That answer your question?
I've heard it said that the father should be the spiritual head of the household and the mother is like the heart. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, so whenever I give this talk about hierarchy, there's a question similar to that about the husband being the spiritual leader in the house. I don't think what I'm saying with the hierarchy of husband and wife being on the same plane is contradictory to that. I think that the husband can still lead spiritually and still be on the same page with the wife. And I've asked a lot of questions to people who are more theologically oriented than me, and they tend to agree with that statement, that it's not contradictory to that. And the roles are different, but they're complementary. And so if we're complementing each other well, then that role, like that parental role, is completely fulfilled. So when we're not complementing each other, or one person is doing more of the work than the other person. Now, a lot of women find themselves in the role that the husband isn't going to lead spiritually because he's not there yet. So someone has to lead spiritually. So I would say that that's better than and working towards that goal of changing those roles. And that's okay, but we can't just sit back and just wait for the husband to step up, because we need to address spirituality. So so even though that's the practice that we want, it may not be the practical application for where we are in our lives. All right. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
One more about the attachment parenting. So to make sure I'm understanding, that's where you're building a good, healthy attachment with your children, and then out of that, then kind of helps with the other, if there's discipline or whatever's involved. It flows from the fact that there's a healthy attachment. Could you talk about if there's an unhealthy attachment?
Sure.
So maybe that there's, I guess that gets into sort of the previous question about how if the kids are taking more time than they ought.
Yeah, so maybe the best way to illustrate it is more of an extreme example. So children need to have a strong attachment by age 2. So a lot of times adoptive families will adopt a child and they don't have the ability to attach because they didn't have that natural attachment. So we get something that's called reactive attachment disorder. And what happens there is children have pretty extreme behavior. So they may have never gone hungry with this new family, but they take food and they hide it in their room because they never feel safe and secure. Right? And so I've worked with kids who have opened up vents and stuck food in the vent so they didn't get in trouble for hoarding food, but it's really important that they're able to hoard the food so that they feel that safety and security, because they can't attach. And so now there's different levels of severity of that, and there's what we would call attachment injuries and some type of therapies where there's that connection is fractured, and we need to repair those connections so that we are able to attach and we're able to trust and enter into a loving relationship. All right. Other questions?
Can you talk a little bit about attachment versus independence, especially when it comes to teenagers?
Attachment versus independence. Help me understand what you mean. I'm not sure.
Obviously there's an importance to have, an attachment, healthy attachment with your children. Definitely as they're becoming teenagers and learning a little bit more about their independence. But as parents, I think it's a big struggle to be able to know how to balance that, how to let go to allow the independence, but yet to still infuse that attachment to make sure that there is a healthy foundation. Does that make sense a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. It's an age-old question, right? The teenager and parent is maybe the most consistent battle that there is, right? Like, I want freedom, you need structure, and then there's that whole battle. Now, I would say attachment, a strong, healthy relationship and attachment is the key to making that. It's always going to be a little bit of a struggle, I think. But what we're really doing in teenage years, right, is we're preparing them to launch, is the psychological kind of terminology around it. We want them to launch into complete independence, or more complete, significantly more independence. So we have to give them some freedoms to prepare for that. What I think, again, I'm going to go back to boundaries and say that we have to set boundaries. And so, hey, if you can come home at 10 and you're where you said you were going to be, for 5 weeks, then we can talk about 10:30, right? Or we can talk about a bigger trip with friends. For me growing up, it was, could we come to the city without parents? That was a big deal. And kind of that freedom of a bigger kind of experience. And talking about dangers and drugs and alcohol, and having conversations as they grow up about those sorts of things, about sexual responsibility, all of that, right, allows us to have a little bit more hope, and it's always going to be a little bit gut-wrenching for the parent. But we can make it easier by having the healthiest attachment that we can have.
You mentioned there are attachment injuries. So from my experience, it seems like when people go through divorce, a lot of times the children do experience attachment injuries. And how do you build on repairing that, because it can continue on for the rest of their life into adulthood?
Yeah, that's a big topic too. I think, again, we need to be open to allowing children to be able to express themselves. I think we need to listen as parents more than we're inclined to listen. Even my 3-year-old, I need to listen more than I tend to want to. I just kind of want her to do what I say. And so if we can learn to listen, we may need to get them help. If we can have co-parenting relationships where mom and dad, even though they're broken up and they don't like each other, if they can still be on the same page and present a united front, that's helpful to children because that gives them some of that structure. It's when they, when they can play mom off of dad, and we know that I can get that, I can get what I want if I present it to, well, mom wouldn't let me do that, and I know dad will give me what I want. Kids are super adept at exploiting that situation. So we have to be aware of that, and parents sometimes just have to get over themselves a little bit and work with the spouse if it can be. Sometimes I understand. I say that and then I'll lock it back a little bit. I understand there's some situations where that's not healthy and that's not possible, but when we can, we need to still present a united front. And then if we have step parents, we got to figure out and talk about how we're going to implement a step parent and how they're going to fit into this hierarchical structure. Okay, thank you for the questions. I appreciate it.